Jesus in the Great Escape, recorded at Hope Church, Crewe.
Right, that's all done. Sorry, I realise I haven't even got my Bible out after all the technology.
Do you need a... Oh, well, there's the flipboard.
There's
Not about that.
We'll do that.
Second half. Do you want
Yeah, probably
you
that
need a
second.
stand, though? Do you not need a music stand for your Bible? No.
I'll put it there. Yeah, and the funny thing is, I often feel a bit guilty nowadays because I've put so much of the information onto the PowerPoint so that actually you can quite comfortably do this having forgotten your Bible because it will all be on.
Yeah.
It will all be on there. So, and then I can remember all those days, when I used to be a kid, going to rather stricter kind of churches because my parents used to go to places that weren't always as free and liberated. There's no doubt Hope Church is. And they would say, who hasn't bought their Bible? So I always have this guilt thing if I don't get it out. So let's just get it out quickly. Open it randomly, upside down. I'll quickly read you a verse. Oh, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. There we go. Now we know that we've led by the Spirit. We've used the Bible fully, properly today. Good. We will be using it a lot. Good. Well, yeah, so was everyone here last time? Yeah,
No,
so
it's not everyone.
not everyone. So yeah, so you picking up the kind of the story and the logic. So I felt a few years back where the Lord saying clearly to kind of starts teaching right through Scripture and just bringing its focus on how Jesus appears. And that's kind of over time it led to PowerPoints and presentations, became manuals, starts to become the books and so on. And when I tell the story, and I'll tell it again, people like Jane, who comes a few times, she's heard this so many thousands of times. but when I was, because I kind of lost my income, I say kind of, yeah, I had, and so I was really, I was quite a stressful period. And some of you know I kind of had some strokes at that time, which is probably all related. And I was praying about what I should do, and I felt the Lord said, just start teaching regularly through the Bible as to how it relates to Jesus, how it relates to me. And my faith-filled response was, well, that won't work, you see. Because I wasn't really asking what should I do, I was asking how am I going to survive. Because I then told the Lord, I said, because people won't pay. You see how it goes. Forgive me for my avarice, this thing. People won't pay to come and hear detailed teaching, you see. The trouble, if you ever kind of have those senses where the Lord said something to you, he does that annoying thing where he doesn't say the next thing afterwards. he doesn't seem to want to get drawn into a conversation. You've asked the question, what should I do? Here's your answer. So, now get on with it sort of thing. But I kind of did have a sense, as I was, that actually it would lead to kind of me having to get stuff out of my head, because you forget how much you carry that way, and onto note paper, onto notes and onto PowerPoints and so on. And I have to say, I've absolutely loved doing it because I know far more today than I did then. So I think the Lord asked me because I knew a reasonable amount at that point. But when you start the process, one of the best way to learn something is to try and teach it. And better than anything else is to try and teach it. So don't try and be perfect before you start teaching stuff. And actually, part of that logic, which I kind of really got, as we started to put the books together, I thought I don't just want this to be informational. And you say, well, how does this work? If you got, because actually the benefit of church to a society is the salting and lighting. So how does it help just to know some things, some weird bits about how Jesus appears in some Old Testament text? Because you don't need to know it to be saved, do you? Be real. But it's interesting how what we feed on kind of really shapes the truth of who we become. And I'm more and more kind of convinced that it's not, if you like, a strategic thing. It's more of a kind of it's kind of more like fertilizer, but that doesn't seem quite the right image. But something that actually kind of feeds us enough to give us strength in who we are. That they often say that the things like the quality of wine, it's not just the grape and the environment, it's often just how far their space, because how much nutrient do they get from the soil. And so there's something of that we are feeding ourselves. And as we read the Scripture, Jesus is quite clear. You read the Scripture, he says to the Pharisees, because you think there's life in them. But, see, in just reading for the sake of it doesn't necessarily give you the life. But these are the things that spoke of me, you see. So Jesus actually kind of says it, doesn't he? You've got the scripture, the Old Testament, the Torah, the law, which we're in today, Exodus, and you think reading it in itself is enough. Okay? By accident, we get fed that way, but actually, he says, and he's kind of therefore putting it, if you'd seen that it was about me, it would have fed you. It would have satisfied you. But because it didn't, but you knew you're supposed to read it, you turned it into this kind of set of laws and da-da-da-da, instead of actually strengthening the confidence I have in a relationship, which is sometimes tricky because the Lord is invisible. That makes sense. And so these things that we do, and I go through ups and downs in my faith, you know. This is always a bad confession time. Because, you know, it's kind of, people know that verse where it says, you know, kind of one doubt and you're out. The one that, you know, in Jude, have you seen? You know, being tossed around or whatever. But actually, we all go through these times where we're so confident in the Lord, and other times when we're a bit unsecure. Sometimes we really know his goodness, and sometimes we think, yeah, well, maybe. Actually, that's the truth. And that's the thing that Jesus addresses at the end of Matthew's Gospel. And he says his disciples worshipped and they doubted. Same sentence, same people. That actually, the Christian life very often is that do you know, I know enough that I know there's something going on here. But I don't always, it's not always so certain to me that I can predict exactly A, B, C, and this is how I'll be. But what I find in that mix is actually, the thing I've grown in certainty is that God has done something through Jesus. And part of that confidence, if I can put it that way, okay, and you might say that seems a rather weak thing, surely I'd be, but what I'm saying is that's my bedrock, is I can't lose that. Do you see what I mean? I can be respectful to people of other faiths, but I could never trade with them because actually I've got Jesus. And that's my foundation. And actually what I realised, which didn't fully kind of get, is part of, I think, what this is about, is not the kind of some of the interesting things we'll see and the historical facts and the symbolism and so on, but actually it's as we, what do they do in your heart? How do they kind of, whoa, that's great, isn't it? I can see a consistent pattern and plan from the Lord, and somehow it all focuses around his intervention. And we thought last time, sorry, this is a very long introduction, we haven't touched on Exodus, but you know how he has spoken through his word and his spirit, Psalm 33 as we're looking at, remember? Through parables and through hidden things. God is a God of love who has communicated, and he has communicated to us in Jesus. And actually we want that to be the filter. We understand everything as we read through the Bible, brings all of those things to the fore. So that's why we're kind of doing it. But so we're looking today specifically at the book of Exodus. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to twist this a little bit this way, because then it's still looking at me. If I stand over here, I can still see the screen. So I know what's on the slide. Just to put the book of Exodus into kind of context, because the first 5 books of the Bible, for some folks this is obvious, and for other it's kind of, you know, we kind of getting it, it's helping put things into place. We refer to them as the books of Moses. And you'll notice that they kind of qualitatively shift a little bit if you read them through. The style of Genesis tends to cover hundreds of years in a handful of verses. Okay, and that's very often is because actually the narrative has come to us during a time when nobody could write. And so actually it becomes to us as kind of in the ways of those sort of mythologies and fables. And so we hear about Abraham, 120 years, and he gets a few chapters, but equally there are 900 years that get a verse, you know, that kind of thing. And so we move from that and we get into Exodus, and as we saw last time, this is the period where the Hebrew alphabet gets invented. It gets actually invented in Egypt while they're living there. And so it took images, we looked at this last time, it took images from the hieroglyphs and started using them to sound out. So if a hieroglyph had a picture of a bull and an ox in Hebrew is Aleph, so they drew a little bull, they called it Aleph, and the sound it made is Ah. See, it's quite easy. They did a little picture of a tent or a house, both of which in Hebrew are called a Beth, and so they called the letter Beth, and it made a B sound. And they invented the world's first consonantal alphabet, which is actually a remarkable thing, because in terms of human development, the invention of a consonantal alphabet, because the Egyptians had hieroglyphs, Sumerians had cuneiform, but an alphabet that's linked to the sounds was such an advance that it exploded our ability to understand things. And actually that comes through the people of God. But the Bible doesn't actually make a big deal of it. It's kind of a means to an end for God. He needed them to be able to record the oracles. He needed them to be able to write down what he was saying to them. Does that make sense? So he gifts them with this alphabet, which now everybody uses. And we saw that last time, remember? How the Aleph actually becomes the letter A in English. Actually, you can see the shape, how the shape has changed. It's never changed over all those thousands of years. So anyway, so in the kind of the mix of things, we move now into Exodus from Genesis. And so Moses is born right at the beginning of Exodus. Well, Exodus finishes off Joseph's story. But then Moses gets born, and of course he then kind of dominates these next 4 books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. And this is the period where the alphabet's been written, and so suddenly for the first time we can write things down and we suddenly get lots more detail. Does that make sense? And so even secular historians now, not all of them, but even some, say that there's no reason to believe that some of the parts of the books of Exodus and so on were real history that were recorded. We just think they were, put through an exaggeration process or whatever. Because actually we now know they've got the ability to do it, so why not? And actually you can see the evidence of it starting with written words in those books. So this is a little bit technical, don't want to be too boring, but just kind of introducing the things. So we go through Exodus. At the end of Exodus, they build the tabernacle. We're not going to do the tabernacle today, even though it's in the book of Exodus. There's a video on my YouTube channel, if anyone wants to go and have a look at it, where we actually build the thing using straws and so on, following the text through. So you can kind of have a look at that one if you want to. We won't do that today. But the book of Leviticus is actually about how the priests are consecrated, because now they have the tabernacle, religious life is going to start. It's going to start with for the first time ever, there is going to be a monotheistic religion in the world. And that's one of the big things that happens in the book of Exodus. It's a major shift in human history. We'll think about that in a second. And then they kind of wander through the wilderness with the priests, and Exodus kind of covers some of that. And then we get picked up with the book of Numbers that tells us a bit more about how they wander around in the desert. And as we get near the end of the book of Numbers, they're standing on the edge of the promised land. They're looking in. Moses is about to die. He actually dies before the end of the book, so it's not non-faith to say that somebody else obviously edited what Moses did, because otherwise it couldn't tell us about his death, So you've got that mix of these words come and probably were first written down, sources, but yes, the priests have to look after them, and so yes, there's some bits, and yes, they use some later words that weren't around at the time and things like that, but that's just, they've taken his legacy, and we've got it now in these books. So we do have the book of Deuteronomy is given there, which is kind of basically Moses' speech to them before they go into the promised land. So that just putting it in historical context. So the big thing here is I want to really pick up is just as we saw while they were in Egypt, God has gifted them with this alphabet. And actually what he does next is, if you think about the faith of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and the patriarchs, just in case anyone's interested, I have actually got the books that you'll notice. This is book 4. Last time we were with book 1, so we've missed out books 2 and 3. Book 3 is about the patriarchs. It covers the patriarchs. The patriarchs had they didn't have, if you like, a religious faith. They had a sort of spiritual faith. God hadn't told them how to do it. Does that make sense? They just did what everybody else did, but they focused on the Creator God. So if you read through their stories, you regularly read about God having encounters with Abraham at oak groves. You notice that? He's sitting by the oaks of Mamre. He's sitting by the oaks of wherever. Okay, and we just think, he's having a rest. But actually we know from ancient world practice and culture, that's where you go to meet your gods. That makes sense? The sacred groves aren't just, they've got names because they're sacred. And they're probably, scholars think that they're probably used by all the pagans as well. So he's just going to where people go to have an encounter with the God they're worshipping. Is that making sense? But the God he's looking to worship, he understands as the creator of heaven and earth. And he knows that he's getting to learn it. Abraham gets to learn this because the God that he's trying to worship tells him to leave his hometown and to go up the Fertile Crescent, and he's with him the whole way. And that doesn't mean very much to us, but in the ancient world, gods were fixed to locations. Does that make sense? So if you worship Dagon, he lived in a particular place. Whereas the God that is encountering and interacting with Abraham, who when he first meets him, he's just kind of his special God, he starts to demonstrate to him how he has authority in so he goes to nearly 3 continents, if you think of it like that. He might go just about far enough north in his journey to be in what we think of as Eurasia, to the European parts, He's in Asia towards the east, and then he goes down into Africa because he goes to Egypt. So it's 3 different continents, potentially. 2 to 3. He's in a huge area of territory, and God is always with him. And you see, we miss the importance of that. That God is demonstrating, you see, I'm not just like those gods, Dagon, Chemosh, and all those who've got their location, and take them out of the area and they're no good. I work the whole way. Does that make sense? And so Abraham's faith kind of really gets stretched and grown. But one of the things we discover, sorry, this is me taking much longer to tell you the story before we get on to Jesus, but one of the things we found written in those Hebrew letters that God gives them is that they start talking about God having a wife. We find these scripts written in Egypt, written in Hebrew, using those little letters. See, they've started to borrow pagan theology into the mix. Well, that shouldn't surprise us, because they don't have anything to tell you exactly how it should work. Abraham's journey gave him his faith. Isaac's journey gives him his faith. Okay, so really what we have at this point is what's referred to, when we start the book of Exodus, as referred to as henotheism. That is where a tribe believes that their God is the most important God, but it's not monotheism. That makes sense? So they think theirs is the most important, but so it's not quite paganism where there's just everywhere you go. Henotheism is everywhere we go, but ours is bigger and more important. So realistically, the nation, the family that's growing from Abraham is his children have had children. They're worshipping Elohim, okay, but they're not worshipping him as a monotheism. He's kind of their God, and he's more important, and they've got the stories, and they know that in history. But in practice, they're willing to kind of adopt things and talk about God's wife, and all of these sorts of things in things they're scribbling down. So some of what I'm telling you we know from archaeology rather than the Bible, but hopefully that's okay. I'm trying to mix the two to give us some kind of confidence. So in that sense, one way of understanding the events of Exodus is that Exodus is this incredible event that changes. So just as language changed the history of the world, the events of the Exodus create monotheism as a world religion. It hasn't existed up to now. There are individuals who in their searching have probably touched and met God. Does that make sense? There's an interesting kind of logic, if you look at the writings of Confucius and you try and unravel them from the things that were added later, where he acknowledges and recognizes the creator God, and he offers a single sacrifice once a year, but he has no other framework for that. There are probably individuals around the world who, recognizing that there was a creator God, try to reach out for him in their own personal way, but they don't birth. Confucianism is not monotheism. But Confucius might have tried to reach out for the creator God. Does that make sense? But actually the Exodus creates monotheism as a world religion. So it's a really big thing. So it's the event that births corporate monotheism. And it's got all of these rituals that everyone can participate in. See? So now it's not just an individual's response. I meet him in the grove. Somebody else here came to meet another God. But when I come here, this is the one I'm meeting. But now suddenly we've got our way, and we can instill it to our children, and we can show our children, we can start to shape their understanding of the world and the way God interacts with it. We can start to shape it much more around God's revealing himself than just our ideas for searching for him. So the story of Exodus is absolutely fundamental because it births the Old Testament religion just as the crucifixion births our faith for the New Testament. So it's the kind of the Old Testament's equivalent of the cross, if I can put it that way, is the Exodus. So it's history, I'll put it there, but it's history that's so important that it becomes a myth. Because we often think of a myth as being something that isn't necessarily true, but that's not what a myth is. A myth could be true or it might not be true, you don't know. But its meaning is more symbolic than historical. Does that make sense? So it's real history, something that really happens, but its meaning becomes much more important symbolically. And as a result, there are well-meaning Jewish people who don't think it happened historically, and there are well-meaning Christians who don't think it happened historically, but they still say they believe in it. Does that make sense? Because what they're saying is, I believe in what it means. Okay. The fact is they can say that because it does mean something bigger than just the history. Does that make sense? But as we're going to see, that part of the revelation that God produces in his monotheism is that one of the ways he interacts with humanity is through our history. It's the way he coaches and teaches Abraham is through his story, his life history. The way he deals with the world and its nations is through history. So actually the historicity isn't trivial. It's important, but it's not the whole story. That makes sense? So anyway, just to kind of put it into its mix. So I put it here. So in the Old Testament, what happens is Yahweh turns the Semites, into Hebrews. Okay, so the Semites were the Sumerians. Do you remember from school days the world's first civilization was the Sumerians? And the words Sumerian and Semite, that's what the two are connected. We put an E instead of a sum, but they're basically the same thing. So God takes some Semites and he turns them into Hebrews, and Hebrew means people who wander around. So he gets them moving around, and Abraham becomes one of those. He's willing to move. And because he's willing to move, God says, I can use that. I can actually teach you that I'm the same over here, over there, and over here. Not someone who's settled will never learn that. Does that make sense? Someone who's willing to move, a Hebrew, which is what the word kind of means. It means someone who wanders. Iber means, so he was the wanderers, the father of the wanderers. So he turns them into nomads, and then the Hebrews become Israelites. In other words, they become a section of those Hebrews becomes the nation of Israel through Judah, who has his name changed and becomes Israelite. So God is kind of shaping, taking the Sumerians, produced so the Semites, he's produced Hebrews who are wandering around, who learn that God is everywhere, same God, same power in all of these locations. He takes one family who he started to develop real history with and given them narrative and shown them things about his nature and truth about himself, and turns them into the Israelites. And the Israelites at this point, they kind of sometimes they adopt things. That's what we're picking up as you dig up the text. They're willing to, they mix a bit of paganism in with the same time. So he then turns them, the Israelites, into Jews, because the Jews now have, although they've got smaller again, you see, he's gone from here's a big civilization, here's a group of them that wander around, here's the group that wander around, here's this family, they grow again, but now they're growing, I've taught them something, but we restrict it now, and so the Jews, of course, were one particular section of that. So by the time we finish the Old Testament, the Israelites have become the Jews. They were just one part of the whole nation. Is that making sense? Then we move into the New Testament, and in the New Testament, of course, the Jews produce Jesus. They produce another individual within that context and culture, with all of the religious things that go on around that. And so Jesus comes along, and Jesus is described as fulfilling a prophecy. He's called the desire of all nations. So you notice how we started with this enormous empire, incorporated lots of places, the Semites, we became nomads, we then became a nation, then the nation just became a tribe, and the tribe became a culture. So I should have said that. The tribe actually becomes a culture because they're not even got a location anymore. Because they get spread, the Jews get spread all over the world again. So they become a culture rather than a nation. But then they get their nationhood back, and then Jesus comes along, and he's now the desire of every nation. Is that making sense? And so as the desire of the nations, he now unites all humanity under the Father, which we read several times in the New Testament. That God is summing up all of his creation to recognise under the headship of Jesus, you see. And actually in world history, that's exactly what's happened. You'll find even in Orthodox Judaism, there is now a recognition that Jesus was significant because he took the worship of Yahweh, the Jewish God, to every nation in the world. Christianity was the first global religion, and it's still probably the only one that is in every single nation of the world. Hear it that way. That actually somehow Jesus has become relevant, and you can worship him in any kind of context, in any kind of culture, and there are tribes and villages in India that worship Jesus in ways that we wouldn't really recognise, but when you meet them, not that I'm saying I have, but sometimes you meet people from all over, and even though their culture is totally different, the same spirit. And that's the remarkable thing. So just kind of putting everything into a big framework. So we looked at this last time. This is actually, it's not a very good picture, but these are where they first found the words written down, which is when the Israelites were living in Egypt. This is the Dofka, was what it's called on the maps for centuries, for millennia in fact. The Bible refers to it as Dumovka. Oh, sorry, that's the other way around. Dofka is the way the Bible calls it. And the Egyptians call it Dumovka, but it's the same place. You read about it, it's where God gives them the manna. And here it is in Sinai. This was the little thing did we look at this last time? I don't think we did. No, we didn't. No. There's a really good video that does this online. I really recommend it if you want to. It's animated. This is actually an inscription. You can't kind of see it in this light. Actually, there you go. I've tried to highlight it. See down here? See that line down there and a line across. And here at a place which the Bible tells us just after God has given them manna, and God has said to them, you've got to respect it. Does that make sense? And here, in one of the scripts that was first encountered but wasn't translated for 50 years because nobody realised it was Hebrew. Does that make sense? Picture of it. I've highlighted 2 sentences. And now I'm going to read it from here. Which is almost impossible because of it's not quite, the text is too small. It's in the book. We got the book. It's in the book. But actually it says, I'll come up here so I can read it. So it's Entoshgan, it actually rhymes. This is one of the other things. It's a little poem. So it says Entoshgan dak, and then the second line, Melab Manak. And actually if you translate that, it says, I've uprooted a crushed garden. You think, what does that mean? Okay. Well, in the ancient world, Egypt is called a garden because it's the most fertile nation in the world in its day, because the Nile, in the hottest sun, it was the most irrigated. Because the hotter the weather was, the more snow melt came down the Nile, which produced more silt, which kind of produced more product. So you remember how they talk about, we have onions, we have this. The Egyptian diet was phenomenal because they could grow so much. So it was like a garden, but you had to cultivate it. It didn't grow wild, but if you cultivated and managed it, it was a wonderful garden. So Egypt is regularly called a garden in the ancient world. So I've uprooted a crushed garden. Something's gone wrong in that garden, and God somehow has turned it over. Something has been pulled out. Does that make sense? And then underneath it says, who is for the Father in regards to your manna? Or you can translate that as who's with the Father has manna. That's another way of translating it. So, and here it is at a point in real biblical history, a location that's referred to in the Bible just after God's given them manna for the first time, written in text that is nearly over 3,000 years old, is a little phrase that's referring to manna and referring to Egypt being crushed and something being pulled out of it. Does that make sense? So, yeah, it is, isn't it? And so I wanted to show it to you on there, and there's a really nice little video, as I say, I've done, which kind of goes into this in a bit more details. And you don't have to look at me because it's animated. See, so that's the benefit there. That's the phrase. And of course, one of the other things which I highlight on there, I'll show you the stone on there as well, where you actually find the name Levi scratched on the wall. See, teach a man to write, and what will he do? Graffiti. That's the way. That's the way it goes. So there is a high possibility that it was therefore the actual idea comes from the Levites, which is perhaps why they're selected as priests, because they become, if you like, those who coach and teach and train and so on and pass the things on. That's just kind of a little by the by. So here's a little bit on the background about the people who are involved in finding that thing, but I'm going to skip over it. But you still hear, regularly you'll hear people make this statement, and this is a thing of a book. Do you remember John McCarthy, who was held prisoner, hostage, for years and years? So he wrote a book called It Ain't Necessarily So, and he writes this, he says, the Exodus, like the story of Joshua's context, remains an exploded myth. So here you've got a secular writer still saying the Exodus doesn't happen. I've just shown you something, which most people would go, oh, now why do they ignore that? Okay. The reason they ignore it, okay, is because at the moment the histories don't match up. You find evidence for every event, pretty much every event from the years of plenty and years of famine. You find so much of evidence for it, but it's just a few hundred years too early in the records. That makes sense? So there's a kind of a mismatch in the current understanding of the timelines. And we look at that in the book, but I'm not going to do it today because we want to focus on how does it show us Jesus. But what I wanted to draw out to you is that actually the problem is not that there's no evidence, it's just that it's ignored because of currently the timeline seems to be out of step. And the problem is with Egyptian timelines. Because the Semitic world that went across the Fertile Crescent and right the way into China used to watch the stars and record what's happening in the skies and the heavens. And so we can actually run computer simulations back and you can date things. If they describe something, that Jupiter kind of crossed paths with Mars, and we know it's roughly in this period, you can then lock down because we can put it on a computer and we can say we know exactly what date that happened. Does that make sense? If there's a solar eclipse and they describe it, then we know where that happened. So Asian culture, running from kind of the areas of Iran right the way through to China and so on, kept records like that. Unfortunately, the Egyptians weren't so bothered. They took much more the flow of the Nile and things like that, the way things were happening in a more agricultural cycle. And so the only thing they ever recorded in terms of astronomy was the phases of the moon. And the problem with the phases of the moon is they're very difficult to measure because you can miss it if it's a cloudy day. That makes sense. A new moon or an old moon, dying moon, you can get it wrong by a day or so. And even if you got it perfectly, that cycle repeats every 13 years. But when you're talking about 1,000 years and you're trying to find, you've got a lot of options. Does that make sense? Not just one. An eclipse isn't that regular. So Egyptian chronology is really difficult. To make it more difficult, sorry, this is a history lesson. You didn't come for a history lesson, but if you're interested in the Bible, this helps us to understand the mix. Is that Egypt sometimes is led by one pharaoh and sometimes up to 14, something like that, because it breaks into smaller bits. It was always administratively broken into small bits. Sometimes it all comes together under one. Sometimes there's one person ruling the south and another in the north, and sometimes it's really broken up. And so actually, even just having lists of kings, you can't kind of go, well, let's estimate he lives this long and estimate and then add them all up because they all cross over. Does that make sense? So we have a really difficult problem trying to put... So guess where I think the problem might be. Why is it that biblical chronology doesn't seem to match Egyptian chronology? Okay, well, the Egyptians are using the same kind of patterns as all of that part of the world that's locked into the stars. So I think probably the error is in Egyptian chronology, if I put it that way. But the trouble is people get very emotionally tied to it. And what's actually sad is one of the leading proponents is himself a Christian. So he therefore, as an evangelical, says, no, this is the way, and it just doesn't match. So we just have to live with the fact it doesn't match. But it doesn't matter because it's the meaning, not the history. Does that make sense? So he doesn't think it matters, so you lose it. So the only real error in dating the Egyptian timeline is nowhere near as footing as the Assyrian and the Israelite dating, which are intertwined with planetary observations. See, this is the other thing, is because Israel and Assyria one keeps writing about the other, and we have two sets of records, keeping records based on the stars, and you can therefore match them really well. But the Egyptian just floats all over the place. But if you can shift the calendar by a few centuries, then suddenly there is masses of evidence. So I'm saying that because you will regularly see on TV people saying there's no evidence for the Exodus. They don't qualify it. They just say there's no evidence for the Exodus. Because they're looking in a period, unfortunately sometimes supported even by Christians, where there is no evidence for the Exodus. Because it probably didn't happen there. Does that make sense? You get the problem. But what we do know, what history does tell us, is that there is a large group of what we can say with certainty as Semites or Asiatics, which are the bigger group from which the Israelites come from. We know that because of their words, so they accept that because we find Hebrew words written all over Egypt. Okay. Even before they had, I'm going off on a tangent, we'll never finish the material today. Even when they had, before they had their own alphabet, hieroglyphs has a clumsy way of trying to sound out words. So it's like, and you'll see this in the video, I explain all this, it would take a whole consonant, like chair, okay, and put chair and cup chair, I don't know if that's a word, can we think of a word? Yeah, but you could put the two together, does that make sense? And you actually, therefore, you find what words that actually sound more Hebrew, but them trying to do it that way, if that makes sense. So everyone acknowledges that there was a period where there was a large group of people speaking a Hebrew-like language, but we can't say precisely because it's not as clear and easy, living in Egypt. We know they were there. And then they suddenly disappear. and shortly after they suddenly disappear, strangely, although it doesn't fit with the current timeline, Jericho gets destroyed and its walls come down. Okay? But they both sit on a timeline that currently, in current historical thinking, is 300 years or so too early for the Exodus. Does that make sense? So, and now over in Canaan, other cities are getting sacked and destroyed at that period. So this was a scientist rather than a historian, a guy called Max Planck. Just put his little quote up here. What he says is the trouble is, he says, a new scientific truth doesn't triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather its opponents die off and a new generation comes through that's not. And that's a serious point, which is, if you think about it, if you've spent 50 years of your academic life working with a system, publishing books on a system, having credits come to you because of a system, you don't like being told it's wrong. Does that make sense? So the way you change it is just that new generations come along who have come with a more open mind. And that is currently what's happening. Is not everybody is agreed on the exact solution, but they're coming with a more open mind than perhaps the generation who sit as the professors at the moment on this. So it's just one of those things. So yes, here's a Professor Heinrich Otten, who's German. He says the Egyptian timeline is a rubber chronology, is what he calls it, because you're always having to stretch it to fit somehow with everything else. So it's just, we'll live with that fact. This is really just my intro because we're getting into the fun bits in a minute. In the book, I trace what we've got by 3 different ways of looking at the timeline. The standard is kind of what currently history thinks and where they say it's all out of step. Does that make sense? A traditional view, which was people like Alfred Edersheim, who's a famous evangelical scholar the Victorians tended to believe, which actually has puts Jewish history a bit older than current thinking does. The reason it does is it takes the Bible more literally. So when it says that there were 400 years, was it 480 years, that they were in Egypt before the Exodus, they took that literally. Modern historians don't take it literally. They say, 480 is 12 times 40. So probably they thought of a generation as being 40 years long, and they knew it was 12 generations, so they just multiplied 12 by 40 and said 480. So we think it's only 240, because we think it's only about 20 years in a generation. Does that make sense? So the traditional view takes the Bible more seriously than the standard view. Okay. And then what I call the radical view is one that's kind of being proposed, which isn't really settled yet, but that's because it hasn't had enough history, but is really radically revising the history of Egypt And now suddenly what you're finding is this stuff is coming together. So I think something probably in truth looks probably more like the radical view, but at the moment it's still a bit fringy. Does that make sense? So for instance, the British Museum used to sell books that included the radical view until a campaign by the professors who go with the standard view, and so they agreed with them that they wouldn't sell books anymore that promote the radical view. Yeah, that's not what you do when you've got a good argument. It's got one when you're invested in in your answer and you don't want people questioning, because they were getting sick. They'd be really rather blunt. They were getting sick of students coming to their courses saying, "Yeah, but I read in this book this. How do you explain that?" "I don't want to explain it." So shut up and stop buying those books. Let's go and talk to the British Museum. Stop them selling them. Oh yeah, no, but things like that happen all the time in the real world. So, and people never think they're evil. They think they're doing it for right reasons. We don't want them to get the wrong idea, so we'll stop them reading it. So kind of the way it goes. So we're going to work from that model anyway, just so we can see some stuff. So anyway, let's start the story of Exodus. So chapter 1. I'm looking for. Oh, there's my coffee. No, don't worry. I get used to drinking coffee that's. We do. I do a breakfast meeting up in London once a month, and we all get there and we all order. And just as I'm standing up to speak, the breakfast arrives, and bacon and eggs is one of the it is one of the great things of the new covenant. Is that but it's not so nice when it's gone cold and it's just turned into a layer of grease on the eggs, and it doesn't work. It has to be the right temperature. just so you know. So now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came out of Egypt. Every man of his household came with Jacob. So Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar. So there's the 12 heads of the 12 sons. And all the souls who came out of Jacob's body, there were 70 souls, and Joseph was in Egypt already. So we start the book of Exodus with 12 heads, tribal heads, okay, and 70 people. Has anyone spotted that pattern before? So Phil is laughing smugly because he's got years of theological training behind him. Yeah. Does anyone recognise that 12 and 70 mix? It's because it's Jesus, isn't it? Again, Jesus has 12 disciples, and who then become 70, a team of 70 or 72. Does that make sense? And we find this pattern. See, these are these little things where you start to see the parallels between the events. We find the pattern of 12 and 70 becomes embedded into Jewish culture as being an understanding of leadership. And it starts here. And of course we see it fulfilled in Jesus as well. So you have 70, because then you get, at the end of the book of Exodus, there are going to be 12 tribes and 70 elders. And when Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin, he stood before a group of symbolically 70. Because the way the Jews understood it is they go up to 74, 72, 73, but it's kind of 70. It's a symbolic 70. Does that make sense? And so Jesus was standing before the 70 again, and here it goes. It starts right at the beginning of the book of Exodus. So these are the guys who go there. So it sets that pattern, 12 brothers and a family of 70, ends with 12 tribes and 70 elders. And that group, it is through their life story of going from 12 to 70, 12 to 70, where the new covenant is established. Just as we find the old covenant is the first covenant is established in the generation, their generation of the 12 and the 70. If you kind of think of it like this, and it's in that same kind of combination we find there at the establishing of the new covenant that Jesus brings in, with the 12 and the 70. So he formally appoints 12 apostles and then later 70 disciples, who could actually sometimes, some manuscripts refer to 72, but as I said, it's a symbolic 70. Same with the Septuagint. Do you remember, if you heard of the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament? It was done about a few hundred years before Jesus comes along. The Septuagint is Greek for 70 because it was the 70 elders of their day that translated it, you see. So that kind of pattern is going through. And so that you kind of see that mix happen. So, quick question, when did Joseph arrive in Egypt? I've not put too many of these in because it's not the key thing, but it ties the history together nicely. So although Joseph really is only there in the first couple of verses of Exodus, he anchors the events really nicely. So it says, now at that time the children of Israel leaving Egypt was 430. Now the children of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. That 480, was a different period, but that's how they shorten that period. This is the 430. That's what it says in Exodus 12. And the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land, that just means kind of passing through it, of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430 years. That is from Exodus 12:40 in the Septuagint, you see. So just to explain what I've done there, most modern translations use what's called the Masoretic text, which is a Hebrew text of the Bible, but is actually from 1,000 years after Jesus. But most modern translations tend to use that. Okay. The reason they do is because it's the most complete. Earlier manuscripts are in bits. See? So they say, well, let's just use it because it's all complete. But can you notice things have changed? So one is saying they were in Egypt for 430 years, and the other is saying they were in Egypt and in Canaan for 430. So in other words, one starts with Abraham, because he was in Canaan, and they were living there, and includes Egypt, and the other ignores that and comes here. Does that make sense? So this is so which is correct? Well, we have an easy way to find out, because the New Testament gives us a quote too. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed, and the law came 430 years after. This is Paul writing. So Paul has settled it for us. The Septuagint is correct, the Masoretic text is wrong. Does that make sense? It's 430. Okay, so that's useful. And also Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, does the same. So all ancient sources tell us that figure encompasses both. But in some modern translations of your Bibles, it doesn't say that. So that's why I'm flagging it. And just to understand why it doesn't. There's another interesting little thing. There's from Josephus. He says it as well. So they left Egypt 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan. So that's how Josephus puts it. Now I know he's not the Bible, he's just history, but he's agreeing with Paul, he's agreeing with the Septuagint, and he's also agreeing with the Samaritans. Because what we forget is that Samaritans also had a copy of the Bible, but they only had the books of Moses because they didn't accept the later books, because the Samaritans were the leftovers when Israel was invaded, the northern tribes were invaded by the Babylonians. And so they became a kind of a mixed race, a bit pagany, but they still had copy of the Septuagint. And strangely, it's not the Septuagint, of the books of Moses. They're older than the ones we get from Judaism. The problem is that they scrubbed out all the bits that are favourable towards Judah and emphasised all the bits. So they've modified them. But they still actually agree that figure. So it's all very boring. But basically it's saying that Joseph arrives in Egypt 20 to 35 years before the rest of his brothers, so they probably arrive around 1690, and we can date that quite precisely because of the calendar things. In the book I explain it. I'm just going to make that statement. So it's telling us, when you put those things together, that in our way of measuring things, we think Joseph has arrived around 1690. In the radical model, which is readjusting the Egyptian timescale, that actually gives this guy, here we go, we've got a statue of him, as a pharaoh that Joseph that became the vizier for. Do you remember in the story how he rises to become vizier to Pharaoh? So it's a time when actually we discover Egypt consolidating under a powerful pharaoh whose name is Amenemhat III. So who wants to say that together? It's not one of those biblical names, isn't it? Amenemhat. I actually find it's all the ends. It's really difficult. Amenemhat III, but the story starts, because he's the pharaoh, that he becomes pharaoh under, but probably therefore the pharaoh before him, who was part when things were a bit more broken up, he was a co-regent, a guy called Senusret III. So this is an image of him taken from the Temple of Amun. Oops. And actually during his reign, what we know from the Egyptian records is that the Nile flood levels started to rise, and it's over a period of 20-something years, they rose very high. And it's been now modelled scientifically, computer modelling. For the first half of that was great news, Because as the Nile floods rise, the land becomes more fertile. Then it goes over a period of 6 meters, and suddenly the water doesn't drain from the land, and you get very bad crops. So it sounds a bit like Joseph's story, doesn't it? 7 bumpy years, followed by 7 disastrous years. But the period is about 20, and there's only 14 there. What happens? Well, interestingly, it seems that Amenemhat solved the problem by digging an enormous canal to divert some of the floodwaters. Does that make sense? So cutting short the disastrous period. Okay? And it's actually, nobody knows when it was first called that, it has always been known as the Bat Yusef, the waterway of Joseph. So we don't know any other name that has ever been called this canal that was built by a guy. You see, people just said, oh, well, probably it became as people became Christian and they read those things. They probably, but it never says in the Bible he built a canal, so why would they give that canal the name? But what we do know is it probably helped him with his Nile floods. Does that make sense? So can you see how real archaeology might be 300 years too early on the standard model, but can you see it really is there and it fits what we see in the Old Testament? And so we know under him, he then nationalises agricultural production. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Because he puts Joseph in charge of agricultural production. So it starts to look like it gets nationalised. He actually consolidates power by this technique. So make, you know, all if you like, the regional independent now dependent on his management, you see. So he builds great grain stores. We know this archaeologically, and it looks like it's there in the Bible. That Joseph oversees the building of grain stores. And each one is led by a regional nomarch. So these are the people who sometimes call themselves Pharaoh, which is why it gets confusing. But they're like a regional governor, if that makes sense. But they still use the name Pharaoh. So, and of course we read here in Genesis, Joseph bought the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every man of the Egyptians sold his field. See? It's all being nationalised. That's what we call it, isn't it? And because the famine was severe and the land became Pharaoh's. So he set up a labour camp in each region, and he creates an enigmatic office of state. He creates a new, yes, he does that. He becomes this new role, which is kind of vizier in charge of agriculture, and we actually find in the records references to a new department in the Pharaoh's government, which is the Department of People's Giving. There we go. Ka-en, this is how Egyptologists write it. Ka-en Jed Remelj, which means the Department of the People's Giving, and there's a vizier in charge of that. Okay, so just interesting. The famine was over the surface of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. And then we read in Genesis that Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanat Paneah. Have you ever seen that? Yeah. I have, those of you who go to Revive, you know, I've got my little nephew and niece, that are Roger and Faith's grandkids, so they get a lot of attention, you know. Don't say that. He's on video. No, they are lovely kids. I did it deliberately. But you know, but they giggle their heads off. You know, if you ever watched Moses, because Pharaoh comes up at one point and says, "I'm going to call you Zaphanat Paneah." You see, and they think it's hilarious, and they go, Zaphanat Paneah. You see, so that's just as a little tip. If you've seen the name there, okay. And see, the people who made the video have not translated it properly, because they've taken it from the Bible where it doesn't mean anything. It's just a weird name. Does that make sense? But here's an interesting thing. We find this word, the first word, in the Egyptian lists of foreign slaves. Okay. So when a foreigner comes in, we find that it's being used of someone who's a foreigner. Okay. So the foreign name, Jadu Enef, actually means who is called. So that Jadu Enef, but actually that DJ is not actually to make the sound. It's the way Egyptologists represent elements from the hieroglyphs, and actually is probably pronounced Zatanaf, whereas this is pronounced Zaphanat. See, the f and the t have just swapped places. Okay, and when you say words in a foreign language, there's a common phenomena that is called metathesis, isn't it? Where you swap consonants around when it's not your natural language. You notice that?
A bit, buddy.
Yeah. But so, for instance, it's a very common thing, because growing up in London, we had a lot of folks coming from African subcontinent where arx is a very common metastasis of ask, okay? And arx, and it becomes so kind of common within the thing, and that's not a racist statement. It's true of every language that goes somewhere else, is that they in kind of repeating the language, that you get this kind of swapping of, so it's a common thing. So that looks to me, so it looks to a lot of people like this Zaphanat is actually the Zatanaf. Really, it just means who is called. So whoever has written that line has forgotten what it meant. They just remember that he was Zatanaf Paneah. Does that make sense? So they've tried in Hebrew letters to make it as close as they can remember it. Does that make sense? So then the question is, so what does Paneah mean? Okay, what does Paneah mean? So Pa is just the Egyptian for the. So Nia, now let's see, who knows some Egyptian words? I'm joking, don't worry. Actually, most people, when I put this next symbol up, will know one Egyptian word. Okay, what's that called? The Ankh. Okay. Now, actually, the Ankh, that is because the way Egyptologists have spelt the word is that, but now we know more about how things were pronounced. We actually know that it's actually vocalized not as Ankh, but as Aniyah. Okay. See, that KH is not a hard sound, it's actually a here bit, that Aniyah. That makes sense? See, because they put those things just to represent elements, constantly, sound elements from the hieroglyphs before, and then as more work was done comparing other languages, they started to work on how were they vocalized. So the way you write an ancient Egyptian word is not the way you say it. That word, which we all say Ankh, is actually the word Aniyah. So Joseph, who is called the Ankh, or the Aniyah, does that make sense? And actually, that means the life. That's what Aniyah means. It's not an irrelevant name. If he's the guy who has saved the nation from disaster, does that make sense? See, so now what we actually know is that there's a very powerful vizier who is called Aniu, or Anku, Aniu. Okay, and he seems to be there in the reign of the pharaoh that comes after Amenemhat. But that doesn't mean to say he didn't start being vizier under Amenemhat. It's just that we first read about him in the pharaoh afterwards. Does that make sense? It would just mean that Joseph outlived Pharaoh, if that was the same guy. And we do know that during Amenemhat III's reign, there was a sub-vizier who is also called Aniu. Okay. So historians are like this. They see a sub-vizier here called one name, they see a vizier a few years later with the same name, but they don't want to assume that they're the same person, which is not unreasonable, just because we've had a prime minister called John, and is there a John in the room? You get the idea, doesn't it, or whatever. Sorry, I'm showing my age. I was thinking John Major when I said that. So I should have said Tony, or call me Dave. Just because we've had is there a Dave in the room? Just because a name is the same doesn't necessarily mean it's the same person. But can you see the pattern? So there's a sub-vizier, okay, and of course the Bible says he rose to be vizier. Well, he does eventually, but actually we read about him when he's the sub-vizier in charge of the fields. He's not taken over from the main vizier, whose name was Simontu. Seems to be the person he took over from. So this is all secular history, just 300 years at the moment off. And then moving on, there's this famous little bit which made it onto the front page of the Times, if anyone remembers it, a few years ago. And this is a set of graves that were excavated. There are 12 graves, and one of them is pyramid shaped, which implies that the person is more important. See? So there's an important grave, and there's 12 in total. And they took a statue out, and here is a picture of the statue, and it is actually multicoloured. And he has, can you see the face? That's not an Egyptian face, it's an Asian face. It's a Semitic face. So we found actually a grave was excavated, which seems to have an important family with a pyramid grave means that the person was in government. Okay. He has to be very senior in government to be able to have a pyramid grave. One there is a little pyramid. In it we find a statue of someone with a multicoloured coat on, and I'm not making this up. This is what I'm saying. But people say, oh, well, we can't assume. Just because it's still 300 years too early. Do you see the kind of the mix? So anyway, right. How long have we got? Do you have a break? Okay, we haven't actually done Jesus in the Old Testament at all, so we'll have to do that all in the second section, because we're now getting on to it. But so really, what we've done in this first section is we've tried to establish that the kind of, if you like, the historical basis for a real Exodus. And in the next one, we'll kind of start to look at some of the sort of ways it symbolises and shows us Jesus. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good. Excellent. Let's take a break.
A lot of that's in the book, isn't it? But
Yeah, it is.
We'll go online as well.
Yeah, assuming we get some good videos out. It's always a bit risky. We'll see what we get.
You can't take
It's a lot.
Chris, I could ask you for a little favour.
Sorry, do you need to switch?
No, I was going to switch that off now.